Honestly, there are 7 people I have never and will never forgive. Not just for one thing, but for a long chain of betrayals. They know exactly who they are, and so do I.
George Harrison.
For young men from Liverpool who conquered the world with their music, brought joy to millions, and seemed like the best of friends on stage. But behind the smiles and the screaming fans, there was a storm brewing. And at the center of that storm was George Harrison, the quiet Beatle, who grew to truly hate one person more than anyone else in the world. This isn't just about musical differences or creative clashes. This is about years of feeling small, ignored, and treated like a child when all George wanted was respect. The person he came to hate wasn't some music critic or jealous rival. It was someone much closer to home. You might think you know the story of the Beatles. You've heard about John and Paul's songwriting genius, about how they changed music forever. But what you probably don't know is the painful truth about what happened to George Harrison during those years of fame. While the world saw 4 happy musicians, George was slowly dying inside, feeling like he was trapped in a cage that he couldn't escape from. And there was one person who held the key to that cage, but refused to let him out. George Harrison didn't start out hating anyone. In fact, he was just a kid who loved music and looked up to his older bandmates like they were heroes. Born in 1943 in Liverpool, George was the youngest member of the Beatles, and boy, did everyone make sure he never forgot it. When he first joined the band in 1958, he was only 14 years old. 14. Most kids that age are worried about homework and crushes, but George was already playing guitar like someone twice his age. The story of how George joined the Beatles is actually pretty sweet. He was friends with Paul McCartney from school, and they used to travel to school together on the bus. Paul saw how talented George was with the guitar and thought he should meet John Lennon, who had started a band called the Quarrymen. John wasn't sure about adding such a young kid to the group. He worried that George was too young and might not fit in with the older guys. But once John heard George play guitar, he knew they had found something special. For the first few years, everything seemed perfect. The boys were having fun, playing music they loved, and slowly building a following in Liverpool and Hamburg. George was happy just to be part of something bigger than himself. He looked up to John and Paul like big brothers, and he was grateful they had let him into their world. He practiced guitar for hours every day, always trying to get better, always trying to prove that he belonged. But as the Beatles became more successful, something started to change. John Lennon and Paul McCartney began writing songs together, and they were really good at it. Songs like Love Me Do and Please Please Me made them famous, and suddenly everyone wanted to hear what Lennon and McCartney would come up with next. The problem was George was also writing songs, really good songs, but nobody seemed to care. Imagine being in a band where 2 of your friends get all the attention for their creativity, while your ideas get pushed to the side. That's exactly what started happening to George. Every time the Beatles went into the studio to record an album, they would focus on John and Paul's songs first. George would sit there with his guitar, with his own songs written in his notebook, waiting for someone to ask him what he'd been working on. Sometimes they would, but most of the time they wouldn't. The person who hurt George the most during this time wasn't John Lennon. John could be harsh and sarcastic, sure, but at least he was honest about it. John would tell you straight to your face if he didn't like something. The person who really broke George's heart was Paul McCartney. Paul, who had been his friend since they were kids. Paul, who had introduced him to John in the first place. Paul, who George thought understood him better than anyone. But Paul had a problem. He couldn't stop treating George like the little kid who used to ride the school bus with him. Even when George grew up, even when he became an incredible guitarist and songwriter, Paul still saw him as his junior. Paul would make decisions about George's guitar parts without asking him. Paul would tell George how to play his own instrument. Paul would dismiss George's song ideas without even really listening to them. According to people close to the band, George saw Paul as difficult, and they would just tolerate each other. But George basically didn't like Paul's personality. Can you imagine how that must have felt? Your childhood friend, someone you trusted completely, making you feel like you don't matter in your own band. The worst part was how Paul would do it. He wouldn't yell or get angry like John might. Instead, Paul would be polite and friendly on the surface, but underneath, he was controlling everything George did. George once said that working with Paul was like being in a bag and they wouldn't let him out. Think about that image for a second. Being trapped in a bag, unable to breathe, unable to move freely, while someone else controls your every move. That's how George felt for years. The tension really started to build during the recording of their later albums. By the time the Beatles were working on the White Album in 1968, the cracks were showing. The recording sessions were particularly contentious, and the fighting was so bad that Ringo actually left the band temporarily. If Ringo Starr, the most easygoing guy in the world, felt like he had to leave, you can imagine how bad things had gotten. George had been writing beautiful songs like Within You Without You and Here Comes the Sun, but getting them onto Beatles albums felt like pulling teeth. Meanwhile, Paul and John could write a song in the morning and have it recorded by evening. George would present a song he had been working on for months, and Paul would immediately start telling him how to change it, how to make it better. But Paul's idea of better usually meant making it sound more like a Paul McCartney song. The breaking point came during the filming of Let It Be in 1969. If you've ever watched a documentary about those recording sessions, you can see the pain in George's eyes. There's one moment where Paul is literally telling George exactly how to play a guitar part, note by note, and George just looks defeated. He's not angry in that moment. He's not fighting back. He just looks like someone who has given up hope. During those sessions, George commented that it felt just like being back in the Beatles, when talking about how controlling the environment was. Think about how sad that is. The Beatles were supposed to be his dream come true, but by the end, just being the band felt like a nightmare. And then George did something that shocked everyone. He quit. Right in the middle of the sessions, George Harrison stood up, looked at his bandmates, and said he was done. He packed up his guitar and walked out the door. For a few days, nobody knew if the Beatles were finished forever. John and Paul tried to act like it wasn't a big deal, but deep down, they knew they had pushed George too far. George eventually came back, but things were never the same. He had tasted freedom, and he realized that he didn't have to accept being treated like a second-class member of his own band. But the damage was done. The trust was broken. The friendship that had started on those school bus rides in Liverpool was hanging by a thread. What made it even worse was that George was becoming an incredible songwriter during this time. Songs like Something and Here Comes the Sun are now considered some of the Beatles' best work. Frank Sinatra called Something one of the greatest love songs ever written. But when George first played for the band, Paul's first instinct was to criticize it and suggest changes. The hatred that George felt wasn't just about music, though it was about respect. It was about being seen as an equal. Paul had this way of making George feel small, without ever saying anything directly mean. Paul would praise George in public, calling him a great guitarist and a talented songwriter, but in private, in the studio, Paul would treat him like he was still that 14-year-old kid who needed to be told what to do. People close to the band said that Paul treated George the same way in the late 1960s as he did when they were kids, even though George had developed into a very good songwriter and lead singer. Imagine being in your mid-20s, being one of the most famous musicians in the world, and still being treated like a child by someone who was only 3 years older than you. George started looking for ways to express himself outside of the Beatles. He became deeply interested in Indian music and philosophy. He studied with Ravi Shankar and brought the sitar into rock music. He found peace in meditation and spiritual practices. But even these interests, which were deeply personal and meaningful to George, became sources of tension with Paul. Paul didn't understand George's spiritual journey. To Paul, it probably seemed like George was just going through a phase, like he was trying to be different for the sake of being different. Paul was always practical, always focused on the music business and making hit records. George's interest in Eastern philosophy and meditation seemed like a distraction to Paul, something that was taking George's attention away from the Beatles. The really heartbreaking part is that George never stopped caring about Paul, even when he hated him. George actually hated it when the press wrote stories about him and Paul feuding, saying they wouldn't get very far with those rumors. Even when their relationship was at its worst, George didn't want the world to know how much pain he was in. He protected Paul's reputation, even when Paul wasn't protecting his feelings. By 1970, the Beatles were done, and George was probably more relieved than anyone. Finally, he could make the music he wanted to make, the way he wanted to make it. His first solo album, All Things Must Pass, was a triple album filled with songs that had been rejected or ignored during his Beatles years. It was like George had been saving up all his creativity, all his musical ideas, just waiting for the day when he could finally let them out. And you know what? All Things Must Pass was incredible. It showed the world what George Harrison could do when he wasn't being held back. Songs like My Sweet Lord and What Is Life prove that George didn't need John and Paul to create amazing music. He had been capable of it all along. He just needed someone to believe in him. But the damage from those Beatles years never really went away. Even decades later, when George would talk about the Beatles in interviews, you could hear the pain in his voice when he talked about feeling ignored and unappreciated. He said many times over the years that the band had to work first on compositions by Lennon and McCartney before focusing on songs by him and Ringo. That's a wound that never fully healed. The saddest part of this whole story is that it didn't have to happen this way. George and Paul could have been great collaborators. They both loved music more than anything else in the world. They both wanted the Beatles to be the best band they could be. But Paul's need to control everything and his inability to see George as an equal destroyed what could have been a beautiful creative partnership. Paul wasn't evil. He wasn't trying to hurt George on purpose. In his mind, he was probably just trying to make the best music possible. But sometimes the most damage is done by people who don't realize they're causing pain. Paul was so focused on his own vision, his own ideas, that he couldn't see how much he was hurting someone who had been his friend since childhood. George Harrison spent years being told he wasn't good enough, wasn't creative enough, wasn't important enough. And the person telling him this, directly or indirectly, was someone he had looked up to and trusted since he was a teenager. That kind of emotional damage doesn't just go away when the band breaks up. It stays with you forever. In later years, Paul seemed to realize some of the mistakes he had made. He spoke more kindly about George in interviews, praising his contributions to the Beatles and acknowledging his talent. But by then, it might have been too late to repair the friendship they had once shared. George Harrison died in 2001, still carrying some of that pain from his Beatles years. He had accomplished so much in his life. He had been part of the most successful band in history. He had written songs that would be loved forever. He had found peace through his spiritual practices. He had helped organize concerts for charity and used his fame to make the world a better place. But he also carried the scars from feeling unappreciated and unloved by someone who should have been his greatest supporter. The hatred he felt for Paul McCartney wasn't just about music or creative differences. It was about the deep, personal pain of being made to feel small by someone who was supposed to care about him. The story of George Harrison and Paul McCartney is a reminder that success and fame don't protect you from being hurt by the people closest to you. It's a reminder that respect and kindness matter more than talent or achievement. And it's a reminder that sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones we love the most. George Harrison was an incredible musician, a spiritual seeker, and a kind person who deserved better than he got from his Beatles years. His hatred for Paul McCartney was really just love turned inside out, disappointment mixed with the pain of feeling invisible. In the end, George found his own path and created beautiful music that touched millions of people around the world. But he never forgot what it felt like to be that young guitarist sitting in the corner, waiting for someone to notice him, waiting for someone to care. That's the real tragedy of the story. Not that the Beatles broke up, but that two friends who had shared so much history, so much music, and so many dreams couldn't find a way to see each other as equals. George Harrison truly hated Paul McCartney more than anyone, but what he really hated was feeling like he didn't matter. And that's something we can all understand, because we've all felt invisible sometimes, even when we're surrounded by people who are supposed to love us. If you found this story as heartbreaking and fascinating as I did, please give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you want to hear more stories like this one. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss when I upload new content about the untold stories behind your favorite musicians. Share this video with anyone you know who loves the Beatles or who might not know the full story of what really happened between these legendary musicians. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.